My first wake-up call on water pollution was in 1967. I was working temporarily at the University of Michigan's Great Lakes Research Center at Ann Arbor because the Great Lakes were badly polluted. The drinking water was greatly at risk from public sources, also from industrial pollution. And it was a wake-up call because we were looking in microscopes and analyzers. What's wrong with the Great Lakes? They're dead. When you would see the freshwater organisms where it was unpolluted flowing into the polluted area, they would all die. And so we were looking at, what's left, what could be the chemistry. It was shocking to me because I hadn't heard anything about this kind of a huge problem. And I said to myself at the time, if it can happen to the Great Lakes, it can happen to the planet. So we had been dealing with a massive amount of chemical pollution, and that's why tonight I'm going to talk about stuck in the mud of the chemical deception. We're still in a way stuck back in the 1950s and the 60s when at the time the government was telling us that a little bit of radiation, a little bit of lead are okay for you. But very quickly it came out, and I've met some of the scientists who were involved in those studies, that there is no safe level of radiation and there's no safe level of lead. We're finding that to be true for mercury and probably for fluoride and many chemicals. So I believe that it's not just a national water crisis we're facing because of all the chemicals in it, whether it's in the raw water or it's what they add and the chemical changes, but there's a national chemical crisis that goes beyond the water. The chemicals are everywhere. And if you study organic chemistry, you go back over 100 years when people began to cook up in laboratories in Europe and North America new chemical concoctions that we've never had in our bodies before. Our children, our babies have never had these things in their bodies. So we are facing a national chemical crisis. Toxic chemicals. So one of the chemical deceptions that's gone on for over 50 years is that they say maybe at a high dose, like radiation or lead and mercury, it's very toxic. But maybe at a low level, it's good for you. This is one of the myths and the chemical deceptions that was dispelled a long time ago. And like I said, I met some of the scientists who interacted with President John Kennedy in 1962 over radiation from the bomb test. There had been 500 atmospheric bomb tests. And basically, what they told him is that if you don't stop the atmospheric bomb tests, you will sterilize the future generations. There won't be any that will be able to reproduce. So in 1962 or 3, there was the atmospheric nuclear bomb test treaty. Okay? So that was a big wake-up call. So in the 70s, I was learning about a lot of these problems because I was working in a laboratory, and many of the chemicals I worked with had these skull and crossbone warning labels on them. So I knew I was dealing with some very nasty chemicals. And then, of course, I'd taken a lot of genetics, including human genetics, that some of these chemicals damage chromosomes in every cell in the body. So I began to become very alarmed. And then in 1975, after I had my PhD, I was teaching environmental biology and talking about what goes into the water, because you have to realize pollution is not just local. We knew by the 60s and the 70s it's global. You can release mercury or PCBs or DDT here, it will move globally, although maybe the highest concentrations will be locally. The big concern, of course, is babies, because they're developing, their genetics, their cell structure, their organs are so small and delicate. You don't want any chemical assaults. This is what the research has been showing for decades, but we have not heeded that. We have not done enough to protect our children from chemical toxins. There's actually over 100,000 chemicals in synthetic production today. Most of them have not been tested at all, except maybe on a few animals. But we're really facing a terrible situation due to this lack of testing and regulation. This should have been another wake-up call. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It came out in 1962. It was about the chemicals that are disrupting the ecosystems, the fish, the polar bears, wildlife, and getting into our bodies through food, through water, whatever. And she actually was a scientist who'd worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she was noticing effects in the environment that she began to report in the 1940s and the 1950s. These were over some of the pesticides like DDT, because these things are very toxic, they're very persistent, which means they can last for decades in the environment, and they're highly bioaccumulative in the food chain. The problem is she accused the chemical industry of spreading false information about the safety of the chemicals when she knew that that was not the case. A lot of these were chlorinated chemicals, okay? We get into this whole issue of chlorine chemistry. So this was a bestseller at the time, but we are still dealing with the chemical deceptions of the 50s and the 60s that a little bit of these toxins are okay. They'll break down in the body. They don't. They bioaccumulate is a big concern, and they can do damage over your lifetime. Okay, so one of the big problems are these untested chemicals, and I put them in red because a lot of them are halogenated chemicals, okay? Halogen refers to a group of elements in the periodic table: chlorine, bromine, fluorine. Iodine is not, it's a halogen, but it's not like the chlorine, bromine, and fluorine chemicals. One of the best known chlorinated chemicals was Agent Orange that contaminated over 50,000 U.S. veterans in Vietnam, because the Agent Orange, an herbicide, was made with two herbicides, one that was badly contaminated with dioxin, a chlorine-containing chemical that there is no safe level of it. So that was one of the wake-up calls, but the problem is that a lot of these chemicals have not been adequately studied. So I want you to, realize that if you ever see the word Cl, which means chlorine, or Br, which means bromine, or F for fluorine, you need to be very concerned that it could be a highly toxic substance. But there's thousands of these things, okay? So it wasn't just Agent Orange that had this, because these were two chlorinated herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid. That was the chemical that was badly contaminated with dioxin, because dioxin was just a derivative of it. Also, PCBs were being used for 50 years in electrical transformers. That's a chlorinated benzene compound. They're now worldwide. They were banned in 1980. They were made for 50 years, but they're everywhere. And many, many other chemicals. There's also the fluorinated chemicals, the synthetics, that are a big problem. Teflon is one of them, okay? I stopped using Teflon 40 years ago because of my concerns about it. So the problem with these halogenated chemicals, whether they have chlorine, bromine, or fluorine, many of them are carcinogens. Many of them cause birth defects. They cause developmental effects. They change the DNA. They may lower the IQ. They may cause sterility. And if it's not sterility in you, it might be your children or your grandchildren. Okay? There's neurological problems. Okay? So anyway, one of my wake-up calls was in 1975, where at the end of this environmental course I was teaching, I had a student come back to me at the end of the semester, and he came to my office. I'll never forget it. He said, "My father has just spent a year studying tap water in the United States. At Christmas, my father gave filters to everybody in the family, to all of his friends. He was an organic chemist hired by EPA to study the chemical contamination of the tap water in the US. He said, don't drink it. It's all contaminated with chemicals." And the student asked me, "What do you think about that, Dr. Carman?" I said, "I'm not surprised." I said, "I haven't done any surveys around the country, but I know the chemicals are they're out there, they're everywhere." Okay? So that was a time when I wanted to, drink filtered water, but it took me a while yet. It was in the 1980s that I stopped drinking tap water in the United States. So one of the concerns with these chemicals is that a lot of them are, oops, I want to go back a slide. Okay, a lot of them are endocrine disruptors. And that's going to be a term I want to talk a little bit about. Because endocrine disruptors refer to chemicals that can disrupt the 7 hormonal producing glands in the body, from the brain, the pituitary, the hypothalamus, the thyroid, the adrenals, and so forth. Because they produce very small amounts of hormones. Well, a lot of these synthetic chemicals, these fluorinated, chlorinated, brominated chemicals, interfere with those glands. That's really bad if it's an infant or an unborn fetus, or even if it's an adult, a woman who wants to get pregnant. You don't want chemicals that disrupt the hormonal chemistry of your body. You don't want it in the diet. You don't want it in the water. Toxins that get into the baby are a huge concern. And back in the 50s and the 60s, they said, well, they won't cross the placenta from the mother if she eats them or drinks them or whatever. Well, that's not true. We have found out that the placenta will download the toxins right into the developing fetus. That's really a disaster, okay? So basically, whatever the mother eats, whatever she drinks, it's going right into the fetus. And how do we know that? Well, okay, this book was another wake-up call. 1996, I met the scientists. This was a follow-up to Silent Spring. They found out that there were these endocrine disrupting chemicals appearing in the wildlife. Rachel Carson talked about the cancers and the sterility, but she didn't know about the hormonal disruptions of the chemicals like DDT and so forth in the wildlife. So John Peterson Myers, Diane Dumanovsky, and Theo Coburn authored this landmark book, Another Wake-Up Call, about the chemical deception, that it's a mess out there in the environment, okay, and in us humans. Anyway, so the endocrine disrupting issue was such that in '96, EPA set up a whole committee, the Endocrine Disrupting Testing and Advisory Committee, to start looking at the 100,000 plus chemicals. And I testified in Houston in sometime that summer of '96, and industry didn't want to testify. But anyway, they did later at some of the hearings. But today, we're still grinding through a few chemicals. So there's tens of thousands of chemicals that have not been tested for being hormonal disruptors. It's a big mess. This is part of the chemical deception. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so one of the things I studied about was in human genetics was shocking. that many chemicals will damage the DNA, the chromosomes, in every cell in the body. So people wonder, how did I get cancer? When we're born, the doctors don't test our blood for carcinogens, although they probably should. And I can assure you today that we're mostly all loaded with toxic chemicals. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, I don't have a slide on it. They've been doing body burden surveys since 1994. They find hundreds of chemicals in us, and that's just where down to the detectability limits. If they went even further down to a 1 part per million, they would find thousands of chemicals in pretty much all of us, okay? So this is one of the concerns why we don't want these in our bodies, because they do damage the DNA. Okay. So, and how do we know they get into the babies? Because in 2004, there was an umbilical cord blood study by Environmental Working Group, and they found an average of 200 toxins per baby. I think it was a total of 287 different chemicals. These are the synthetics out there. It's not just the pesticides, but it's mercury and lead, and I don't even know if they look for fluoride. But anyway, they published all this, and 180 of the toxins cause cancer in humans or animals. 217 are toxic to the brain and the nervous system. 208 toxins cause birth defects or abnormalities in development in animal tests. Their conclusion, the dangers of pre- and postnatal exposure to this complex mixture of carcinogens, developmental toxins, and neurotoxins have never been studied. These are complex mixtures. Our toxicology is like a primitive science. What is EPA doing? Well, like I said, they formed the committee in 1996, and they're slowly going through the chemicals. It'll take them 1,000 years or more. There's big concerns today about developmental neurotoxicity, and I'm not going to go through this, but it's a huge problem because we're seeing a lot of issues with children, and it's not surprising. They're loaded with chemicals, and we don't know enough about it. I'm going to skip over this. Okay, so these trihalomethanes, should raise a red flag because they are halogenated. They contain fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and they shouldn't be in the water supply, is my opinion, until they have been tested to have no effect. I don't think that's going to be the case. So the water is not clean here in Texas or across the US. The only place I've been to where I think it's pretty good is Mount Shasta, California. It's groundwater. It's not, or spring water, I should say. It's spring water. It's not chlorinated or anything. But there's very few places in the United States where the water, I think, is clean enough that I would drink it, okay? Go back one slide. Well, anyway, they, for the trihalomethane standard, they use 80 parts per billion, averaged over a year. Well, I think that's a pretty weak standard. It's not, okay. So I think that standard probably should be less than a part per billion. So I don't think that's a safe drinking water standard. And maybe in 20 years, they'll get down to a part per billion or less, okay? None of it should be in the water, okay? Anyway, so these trihalomethanes are formed because the stuff that's in the raw water reacts with the chlorine. The chlorine's contaminated by bromine. I've been to Arkansas where the chlorine salts are mined. It's contaminated with bromine. So the chemical companies that sell the chlorine to all these cities around the US, they got bromine. So you get not just the chloroforms and those chlorinated halomethanes, you get the bromines, and those are very, very toxic as well, carcinogens. And then there's some other cancer risks, okay, that I don't know if they look for them all here, but there's some cancer-causing chemicals. They're halogenated compounds, 1,2-dichloroethane. It's got a very serious cancer risk. And also trichloroethylene. If you watch the movie A Civil Action, This was actually the result of a best-selling book in the 1990s. It happened near Boston, Massachusetts, and children were dying of cancer from solvents in the water, and they were chlorinated compounds, okay? So the actor in the movie was John Travolta. What the movie doesn't tell you, it just says it was the water. It was the 10-minute hot shower. The solvents were evaporating, and the kids were breathing in, getting inhalation exposure, along with drinking it and so forth. Anyway, so there's also halogenated compounds that are called acetic acids or haloacetic acids that have chlorine and bromine in them. And they have cancer risks as well. So it's more cancer risk besides just the trihalomethanes. This is something that Environmental Working Group has on their website, okay? They looked at the hexavalent chromium levels at Mesquite. This was based on the data that's been submitted, and the level that was detected was 0.11 parts per billion. But the health guideline that they were putting up there is 0.02 parts per billion. In other words, the level was much higher than the health guideline. Bromodichloromethane, okay, also much higher. So anyway, this is on their website, and basically it suggests that if we really had truly protective standards for the stuff that's in the water, they would have to have more filters in there to get out a lot of these chemicals or prevent them from forming in the first place. And this is just some of the chemicals that they look at. I know that there's actually analytical chemistry where they're looking at about 70 compounds. I wouldn't be surprised that you could find 10,000 in there if you went down to a part per trillion or even less than that. These are some more. Chloroform, of course, has a level that should be no more than 1 part per billion, has a guideline, and they detected 15.2. That's just, one test. So even though it's legal to have that level in the water, that's why I stopped drinking tap water over 30 years ago. I'm very concerned about it. So to get out a lot of the chlorinated chemicals, they're bigger than the fluorine or the fluoride, so they're a little easier to take out. But then you have the issue of do you want to bathe in it? Not really. The chlorine and the chlorinated compounds, the trihalomethanes, are an issue in a bath because you're going to breathe it in. The fluoride is more of an ingestion issue from cooking and drinking with it. There's not that much in the water typically. So it's not a problem in the bath. But there are ways to filter these things out. But the cities should have better treatment systems, and they shouldn't be allowing it in the water. So now the fluoride. So this is what's in mother's milk, 0.004 parts per billion, or 4 parts per billion. Okay, a very tiny amount. That is considered to be, what's in mother's milk, and it's a safe level. Now, what does the EPA allow in the water? Well, it's 175 times more than that, okay? It's 0.7 ppm, or 700 parts per billion. So that's 175 times higher than what mother's milk should have in it, okay? Or any, anything we drink or eat. Now, what you don't know about is that fluoride was connected to the Manhattan Project in World War II. Anybody hear of the Manhattan Project? Do you know that fluoride was used in the manufacturing of the atomic bomb? So, how did that happen? Well, I'm going to touch on that at the end, okay? So Bill Hersey, who was a scientist I've met, he's retired from EPA, he testified 20 years ago or 30 years ago about the toxicity of fluoride compared to lead and arsenic. I mean, those lead and arsenic, you don't want any in your diet or in your body. And so fluoride is right in between in terms of toxicity. This came from a textbook that was written over 25 years ago by two Dartmouth University toxicologists. So, you know, it's a very, very toxic material. Now, in 2006, the National Resource Council had an expert panel of 12 scientists from across the U.S. And basically, they concluded their findings should have ended fluoridation right then. What they found was that, okay, there's too much infants are getting overdosed with fluoride, too much, okay? Damages the brain, and fluoride is neurotoxic, okay? It damages the bone. If you have dental fluorosis, you're going to have bone damage. It's not just the teeth, okay? And there's a lot of evidence for that. And finally, it will mess up the thyroid because the thyroid will not be allowed to incorporate iodine because the fluoride will disrupt that biochemical process through interfering with the enzymes. So, okay, so where does all this fluoride come from? Well, it's a waste product. It's a toxic waste. One area is the phosphate fertilizer industry in Florida, Louisiana, other places. And because they can't keep it in the fertilizer, if you leave fluoride in the fertilizer, it will kill any plant you put it on. It's very deadly to plants, okay? It disrupts enzyme systems at very low levels, so they put it in the water. It's not a good idea. So some of it comes from the phosphate fertilizer industry, some comes from the chemical industry, some comes from the aluminum industry, and some from the nuclear industry, okay? And this is a tanker truck. It's like a hazardous waste tanker truck that's coming in, and it's offloading it. And I've been in a water treatment plant in Austin where they leaked it onto the concrete, and it left a hole because this stuff is so acidic. It eats glass, it eats concrete, and they're putting it in the water. I mean, I knew this in the 70s that this was one of the most acidic, corrosive materials you could possibly have, okay? And so the EPA has classified fluoride as an endocrine disruptor, okay? In other words, it disrupts, for example, the thyroid, and probably all of the 7 endocrine glands are messed up by fluoride alone, okay? The National Research Institutes of Health, research shows that endocrine disruptors may pose the greatest risk during prenatal and early postnatal development when organ and neural systems are forming. Fluoride risk, reduced thyroid function in pregnant women is linked to lower IQ in their children. So so this is one of the chemicals. It's hexafluorosilicic acid. It's got 6 fluorine atoms with 1 silicon atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. It's called hexafluorosilicic acid. It's got a bunch of other names too. It's a toxic industrial waste. Versus, now the natural fluoride in the water isn't that great either, calcium fluoride, but calcium is a natural buffer for the toxic effects of fluoride in the body. But calcium fluoride can also be a problem around the world and here in Texas. But it's very different. So what's in this toxic industrial fluoride waste? Well, there's arsenic. Arsenic is a cancer-causing chemical. That's a CCC. It causes neurotoxic effects. It causes birth defects. It's a mutagen. It causes reproductive effects. So all of these metals are in this fluoride waste, okay? Arsenic, chromium, cadmium, lead, mercury, beryllium, barium, and several other metals. So it's loaded, and we think also that it's got some radionuclides. Now, why would that be in there? Because when they mine the phosphate, or in Florida, Louisiana, there's NORM materials, naturally occurring radioactive materials like uranium. You don't want uranium in your water, okay, or any radionuclides. This is a study from an Irish scientist, Declan Waugh, who looked at the cascading effects of this fluoride or hexafluorosilicic acid in the body and the biochemistry and the organ systems, it's really quite graphic that it has dramatic effects and at very low levels, because fluorine is such an electronegative element that you don't want it in your system at all. In 2015, there was a landmark epidemiological study in Britain. They compared hypothyroidism in a fluoridated part of London to a non-fluoridated area where they had the medical records. And what they found was, well, they asked the question, are fluoride levels in drinking water associated with hypothyroidism prevalence in England? A large observational study. It's quite dramatic what they found. Basically, it was the first epidemiological, in other words, large populational study look at control group versus a fluoridated area. They found a link between hypothyroidism, in other words, the thyroid is not working properly. We found that higher levels of fluoride in drinking water provide a useful contribution for predicting prevalence of hypothyroidism. It's interfering with the thyroid. And they said high hypothyroid prevalence was found to be at least 30% more likely in practices located in areas with fluoride levels of, above in excess of 0.3 milligrams per liter. This population study supports earlier hypotheses that fluoride is associated with hypothyroidism. It's an epidemic today, not just in England, but in the United States. We found that higher levels of fluoride in drinking water provide, okay, we already mentioned that one. So there was another study, okay? Ashley Mallon and Christine Till did a huge study across the United States looking at fluoride and ADH levels in children. And basically, they found that exposure to fluoridated water and ADHD is a growing concern in the United States. And this was a study based on 3 different years of data. Okay, let's go to the chart. It might be the next one. Okay, there's a graph. Okay, they looked at 3 years across the United States, 2003, 2007, and 2011. And so the bottom one is 2003, the middle one is 2007, 2011. These are different states and the amount levels of fluoridation and the levels of ADHD. They found a high correlation between the amount of fluoridation in different states and the levels of ADHD. So they're doing more studies. They said parents reported higher rates of medically diagnosed ADHD in their children in states in which a greater proportion of people received fluoridated water from public water supplies. So that was another major study that was done. Okay. The weight of evidence from many animal and human studies is that fluoride is a potent neurotoxicant. Okay, in other words, it interferes with brain chemistry. And 52 out of 59 studies have found an association between fairly modest exposure to fluoride and lower IQ. China, India, Mexico, Iran, and there's work being done in the US. 19 of these studies, the fluoride concentration was less than 4 parts per million, which EPA says is the current safe drinking water standard. Over 100 animal studies have found fluoride damages the brain. These are the findings: damages to the hippocampus of the brain, neuron degeneration in the nervous system, inhibition of a key enzyme called cholinesterase. It's very important in neurotransmission. Damage to the nicotinic receptors in muscles. Decreased brain glucose utilization. Glucose is a very important nutrient in the brain, and it increases oxidative stress, which is not good. This is a Harvard meta-analysis of IQ studies, a group of researchers at Harvard. looked at a group of these IQ studies. It's called a meta-analysis. And basically, they published this just a couple of years ago, 2012. They looked at 27 studies comparing IQ in high versus low fluoride villages, okay? The study was published in a prestigious journal, Environmental Health Perspectives, okay? So it went through complete peer review. And what they found, the results were remarkably consistent. In 26 of 27 studies, there was a lower average IQ, brain damage, in the high versus low fluoride villages, okay? Average IQ lowering was about 7 IQ points. Dramatic, okay? So, in the preliminary study of 51 children, the children were asked to remember a sequence of numbers and report both forwards and backwards. What they found is that children with dental fluorosis, in other words, they have fluoride exposure enough to cause damage to the teeth, developing teeth, probably affected the brain, that those children performed less well in terms of recalling these numbers than those without the dental fluorosis damage to the teeth. Dr. Philippe Grandjean, he's at the Harvard School of Public Health. Fluoride seems to fit in with lead, mercury, and other poisons that cause chemical brain drain. So it's a huge concern, and that's so. You know, if you're concerned about the health effects from the drinking water, I think you have to look at everything. But fluoride is a big one. But all of these other halogenated chemicals, they're all toxic from one degree to another. And there's none of it should be in the water supply. So why was fluoride top secret? Uranium hexafluoride. In other words, to make the U-235 isotope, which was the bomb grade uranium, to separate it from U-238, which was stable, and that was the most common isotope, but you couldn't use it to make atomic bombs. They needed to get the small amounts of U-235 separated. They converted it to uranium hexafluoride. So the fluoride component was top secret in the Manhattan Project. They were working with chemical companies like DuPont and others to make enough of the fluoride compounds that they could use in the chemical reactions to make the uranium hexafluoride and create the bomb-grade uranium. The Manhattan Project, even the name was top secret for many, many years. So the fluoride chemistry was ultra top secret. And this didn't come out until the 1990s when there was a woman who wrote a book called The Plutonium Files, 1999, I believe, won a Pulitzer Prize. And then there's other investigative journalists who've been documenting this. So what happened was, let me go back. Okay. So the problem is, it wasn't just in the bomb project that the workers were dying of the fluoride exposures. They were having bone problems, all kinds of disabilities. But in the areas where the DuPont and other companies were manufacturing their fluoride chemicals, the farmers were reporting deaths and injuries to their animals, horses, cows, everything. Farmers were reporting injuries to their fruits, their fruit trees and vegetable crops. So anyway, there was a huge problem, not just for the U.S. government and the Manhattan Project, but for DuPont, for the Alcoa that was using fluoride chemicals as a catalyst. Hydrofluoric acid, HF, is a super catalyst used in the aluminum industry, the steel industry. So the government people said, well, we don't want it out there that we're using these fluoride chemicals in making the atomic bomb. And so, they said, we need to find a way to tell people it's really safe. Let's put it in the water supply. So it really is one of the biggest chemical deceptions that came out of World War II. And it's still really not out there. And I think this is part of the reason why the government's been so, there's no law that says you have to put it in the water supply. But as Dr. Hersey and other scientists at EPA, they tried to fire some of these people for even raising the issue. that they thought this was so toxic it shouldn't be in there. So that's why this goes back to, you know, the Manhattan Project. Anyway, so conclusions. Risk of children's IQ loss at current fluoride levels in the U.S. is very high, okay? Fluoride exposures must be reduced. I don't drink any tap water at any restaurants. I haven't for decades, okay? Addition of fluoride in drinking water and the use of fluoride tablets must cease. It doesn't really work. That's what the science is revealing. It's too toxic for anybody, not just children. The economic consequences of IQ loss for U.S. children are substantial. We think it's in the tens of billions of dollars. So first, do no harm. Add no fluoride or toxins to the water. And so that's why I think that this is a big problem, not just in terms of water, but you know, if you go out to eat anywhere, they bring you a glass of tap water and ice. Won't drink it, okay? I take my own water everywhere, okay? Use filtered water. I don't want the fluoride in my body. I'm already almost 73 years of age. I'm very concerned about carcinogens because I've lost 4 older siblings to cancer, beginning in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And so I knew the family members would ask me, well, what's wrong with brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so? Why they get cancer? I said, the chemicals are everywhere. I said, it's not just one thing. It's a smorgasbord of chemicals. So I work with a lot of these. I know they're in the water, they're in the foods, they're everywhere. And so we have to do what we can to reduce our toxic exposure, because then you will live longer, you'll be healthier, your children, your grandchildren will be healthier. So that's my message here, that you need to organize, get elected officials concerned that the level of toxic chemicals in the water is too great and it needs to be greatly reduced. They can do it, it costs money. We need to change the standards with the EPA. And that's another thing. But, you know, anything's possible, because it really begins with the public making a lot of noise about these kinds of issues. And so, anyway, I'm happy to participate. Anyway, I wasn't going to show those, but thank you very much, okay? I know we have some other things to show, but I'll take like one question.
What do you use to filter your water? And number one is what do you think of reverse osmosis?
RO works pretty good. It may not be quite 100%. It's close to it. The fluoride is a very small material, and it's more difficult to filter out than fluorine. But yeah, I use a dual filter system that works pretty good. Fluoride, there's not a lot of it, so whatever you can do to reduce it, it makes a big difference. It's an ingestion issue. You won't get much in a bath or a shower. There's just not that much to go through the skin. I wouldn't drink any bath water, but I have bath filters too, okay?
Infrared saunas?
Yeah, you can sweat a lot of toxins out, for sure. You know, that certainly is a good strategy. I think anything you can do to get rid of toxins, sweating. The skin does have about 7 million pores, so you can get rid of a lot of things through the skin. It's the quickest, fastest way to detoxify.